Nathan was only 10 years old when he walked into that Manhattan boardroom. The executives laughed at his torn clothes and dirty face, but what happened next made the most powerful man in New York fall to his knees. This is the story of a boy who carried nothing but a worn notebook and a promise made to his dying grandmother. The autumn wind howled through the streets of Manhattan, carrying the distant sounds of taxi horns and the endless rhythm of a city that never sleeps. On the 52nd floor of the Worthington Tower, behind walls of glass that reflected the grey October sky, Charles Worthington stood frozen in front of a whiteboard, covered in equations that seemed to mock him with every passing second. 58 years of life. 30 of them spent building the largest structural engineering empire on the East Coast. And now, everything he had worked for hung by a thread so thin it could snap at any moment. Charles loosened his silk tie and turned to face the 7 men seated around the mahogany conference table. His most trusted executives, the brightest minds that money could buy, and every single one of them wore the same expression of defeat that made his stomach turn with a mixture of rage and desperation. The problem was deceptively simple to explain, but impossible to solve. A critical error in the structural calculations of a 45-story residential tower rising in Midtown Manhattan. The mistake had been discovered when construction was already halfway complete, when 22 floors of concrete and steel already stood tall against the skyline, when hundreds of families had invested their life savings into apartments that might never exist. If the error was not corrected within 3 weeks, the entire building would have to be demolished. $400 million reduced to rubble. Lawsuits that would drag through courts for decades. The certain bankruptcy of everything Charles had spent his entire life constructing. Richard Palmer, his chief financial officer, was the first to break the suffocating silence. "Mr. Worthington, perhaps we should consider reaching out to that firm in Switzerland. They specialize in exactly this type of—" "We already tried Switzerland," Charles cut him off, his voice sharp as broken glass. "We tried Germany, Japan, and that group from Israel that charges more per hour than surgeons. Nobody can solve it. Then maybe it is time to accept that—" "Accept what, Richard?" Charles slammed his palm against the table with enough force to make the coffee cups rattle. "Accept that I am going to lose everything I built in 30 years. Accept that Charles Worthington, the man who designed half the skyscrapers in this city, cannot finish a single building." The silence that followed was heavier than lead. Helen Chen, his executive assistant of 23 years, appeared at the doorway with a troubled expression. Something was wrong. "Mr. Worthington, we have a situation in the lobby downstairs." "Helen, I am in the middle of a crisis that could end this company. What situation could possibly be important enough to interrupt?" "Security found a child in the building. It appears he entered through the loading dock area. They want to know what to do with him." Charles rolled his eyes with an impatience that bordered on contempt. "Call the police, a shelter, whatever. This is not my problem." "You do not understand, sir." Helen hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "The child is here, on the executive floor. He passed through every security checkpoint without anyone noticing. They only discovered him because the surveillance cameras caught him." Before Charles could respond, the conference room door swung open and 2 security guards entered, each gripping the arm of a small boy they dragged between them. The child could not have been more than 10 years old. His hair was the color of autumn leaves, but so dirty and tangled it looked like straw. His face was smudged with dust and something that looked like motor oil. His clothes told a story that needed no words. A grey t-shirt torn in at least 4 places, shorts that hung too loose on his thin waist, and on his feet, sneakers so worn they barely held together. But it was his eyes that made Charles pause for just a moment. Brown eyes that gleamed with an intensity that seemed almost unsettling. There was no fear in them, no shame, only a calm that seemed completely out of place. "Found him going through the trash in the break room on the 48th floor, Mr. Worthington," the older security guard explained. "Probably came in looking for food scraps." Richard let out a mocking laugh that the other executives echoed reflexively. "Well, would you look at that, Charles? At least the city's vermin are getting more sophisticated. Now they invade luxury buildings." More laughter rippled through the room. The boy remained motionless, watching the men in their expensive suits with those eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances. Charles approached the child, bending down until their faces were almost level. The imported cologne he wore created a stark contrast with the smell of the streets that emanated from the boy. "Listen here, kid. Do you know where you are? Do you know this is private property? That I could have you arrested for trespassing? The boy did not respond. His eyes had drifted to something behind Charles, something that captured his entire attention. The whiteboard, the formulas, the numbers that no specialist could decipher. "Hey, I am talking to you." Charles snapped his fingers in front of the boy's face. "What is your name? Where did you come from? Who sent you here?" The boy finally looked back at Charles, but his voice came out calm, almost gentle when he answered, "I can solve that for you, sir." The sentence hung in the air for a moment of absolute silence. Then Charles began to laugh, a loud, cruel laugh that echoed off the glass walls like the bark of a wild animal that had just cornered its prey. Richard and the other executives joined in, some clapping their hands, others wiping imaginary tears from their eyes. The scene was so absurd it seemed scripted for a bad comedy. "Did you all hear that?" Charles turned to his audience, still laughing. "This street kid, this little garbage picker, thinks he can solve a problem that defeated the best mathematicians in the country, a problem that cost $500,000 in consulting fees, and this barefoot little beggar is going to solve it. Maybe he learned structural calculus at the school of the gutter," Richard added, drawing more laughter. "Or perhaps the formulas come written on the food wrappers he finds in the trash." The other executives clapped and cheered, some reaching for their phones as if they wanted to film this moment of corporate comedy. The boy remained still, while the laughter rained down on him like stones. His face showed no anger, no humiliation, only that strange calm that seemed to belong to someone much older. Charles stepped closer, this time with his finger pointed at the boy's face. "Listen carefully to what I am about to tell you, kid, because I am only going to say it once." His voice was low now, venomous. "You are nothing. You will never be anything. People like you do not touch things that people like me build. You exist to clean our garbage, not to solve our problems." He paused dramatically. "I can solve this on my own. I do not need some filthy street urchin sticking his nose where it does not belong." The security guards tightened their grip on the boy's arms, ready to drag him out. "Get this thing out of my sight, and next time, do your jobs properly." The men began to pull the boy toward the door, but before they could reach it, the child did something unexpected. With a quick movement, he slipped free for just an instant, grabbed a napkin from the coffee station in the corner of the room, and scribbled something with a pen lying nearby. Everything happened in less than 5 seconds. "Hey, what do you think you are doing?" One of the guards grabbed the boy's arm again. The child did not resist. He simply let the napkin fall gently onto the mahogany table and allowed himself to be taken away. The door closed. The laughter died down slowly. The executives returned to their seats, some still making jokes about the little genius from the gutter who had appeared to save the company. Charles ignored the napkin. He had more important things to worry about. The meeting continued for another 2 hours without any progress. When the sun began to set over Manhattan, painting the sky orange and red through the glass walls, the executives left one by one, defeated. Helen was the last to leave. "Mr. Worthington, do you need anything else?" Charles shook his head, his eyes fixed on the view of the city he had helped build, the city that now threatened to swallow him. "You can go, Helen. I'm going to stay a while longer." When silence finally took over the room, Charles let himself collapse into one of the chairs, feeling the weight of all his 58 years pressing down on his shoulders. That was when his eyes found the napkin. It was there, forgotten in the corner of the table, a piece of white paper with something written in blue ink. Charles almost threw it away without looking. Almost, but something made him hesitate. Maybe it was the exhaustion, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was that inexplicable feeling that the universe was about to play a trick on him. He picked up the napkin and looked. What he saw made his heart stop. Numbers, formulas, a sequence of calculations written in a surprisingly steady hand for a child. Each line flowed into the next with relentless logic. Each variable found its exact place in the equation. Each step of the reasoning built a perfect bridge to the final result. And in the center of it all, circled twice as if the boy wanted to make absolutely sure it would be seen, was the solution. The solution that 6 millionaire consultants, 3 elite universities, and 2 international firms had failed to find. Charles blinked. Read it again. His eyes traced every number, every symbol, searching for the error that surely had to be there. No street child could have solved this. It was simply impossible. He jumped to his feet and rushed to the whiteboard, compared the numbers, verified every variable, every constant, every step of the reasoning. The solution was perfect. flawless, complete. His hands began to tremble. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his own ears. He looked at the napkin again, searching for some explanation for this impossible miracle. That was when he saw it. Below the calculations, in smaller letters almost hidden in the bottom corner of the napkin, there was a sentence. A single sentence that made the blood of Charles Worthington freeze in his veins. Grandmother Margaret sends her regards. The napkin slipped from his fingers and floated gently to the floor. Grandmother Margaret. That name. That name he had spent 30 years trying to forget. The glass walls seemed to close in around him. The city outside, which had always seemed so small from this height, now looked like a giant creature ready to devour him. Charles stumbled to the nearest chair and collapsed, breathing in short, desperate gasps. Margaret Holloway was dead. He was certain of it. He had verified years ago, when the fear of being discovered still haunted his nightmares. He had read the obituary in the newspaper. So how? How had that name come back to haunt him after so long? And what did that street boy have to do with a ghost from his darkest past? Charles looked at his own hands. They were trembling uncontrollably. The most powerful man in structural engineering, the businessman who made governors answer his calls, was trembling like a criminal awaiting his sentence. Because that was exactly what he was. A criminal, a thief, a man who had built his empire on a lie that now threatened to crumble. Outside, night was falling over Manhattan like a dark cloak full of secrets. And somewhere in that immense city, a 10-year-old boy with torn clothes walked through the cold streets, with a serene smile on his face, clutching against his chest a worn notebook that was worth more than all the buildings Charles Worthington had ever constructed. The first piece of the puzzle had been placed, and Charles, even without knowing it yet, had already begun to fall. Charles did not sleep that night. He did not even try. He sat motionless in the leather armchair of his penthouse apartment, the crumpled napkin clutched between his fingers, his eyes fixed on some invisible point on the wall. The city glittered below through the panoramic windows, millions of lights blinking like fallen stars, but he could not see any of it. All he could see were the shadows of the past that now returned to collect their debt. Grandmother Margaret. The name hammered in his mind like a church bell announcing a funeral. Each toll brought a memory he had spent 3 decades trying to bury in the deepest corners of his soul. Charles closed his eyes and let the past swallow him whole. 30 years ago, he was just an ambitious young man of 28, freshly graduated in engineering from a second-rate college, with a diploma that impressed no one, and a hunger to succeed that burned in his veins like liquid fire. He had managed to get an internship at Morrison Engineering, one of the largest firms in the industry at the time, thanks to a distant cousin who knew someone who knew someone. The salary was miserable. The work consisted of serving coffee to the real engineers, organizing dusty files, and pretending he was learning something while counting the minutes until he could leave. Charles hated every second of it. He hated being invisible. He hated being treated as if he was worth nothing. But there was one person in that company who treated everyone with respect, regardless of title or position. One person who greeted the intern with the same warm smile she reserved for the directors. Margaret Holloway. She was not a professor in the traditional sense, though everyone called her that out of respect for her 15 years teaching advanced mathematics at Columbia. Her talent for structural calculations had quickly transformed her into the most respected engineer at Morrison. She taught everyone around her, freely sharing knowledge that others would have guarded jealously. Margaret was 54 years old back then, with silver hair she kept in a simple bun, and kind eyes that seemed to see the best in everyone. She wore the same modest blue cardigan almost every day, the one her late husband had given her. She did not drive an expensive car or wear a luxury watch. She lived in a small apartment in Brooklyn with her son Robert and his wife Anna, who had recently married and were just starting their life together. By every measure Charles used to define success, Margaret Holloway was a failure. But there was something about that woman he could not ignore. Margaret had been working on a secret project for almost 4 years, a revolutionary formula for structural calculations that promised to change civil engineering forever, an equation that would allow buildings to rise taller, safer, and with far less material. A discovery worth millions. Charles discovered this by accident. He was delivering coffee to a meeting when he passed by Margaret's office and saw her hunched over notebooks filled with numbers, her eyes shining with that passion only true geniuses know. He stood watching through the crack in the door, fascinated and envious at the same time. In the weeks that followed, Charles began to approach Margaret. He offered to help carry materials, asked questions about her projects, demonstrated what seemed like genuine interest in her work. Margaret, who was far too trusting to suspect anyone's intentions, was touched by this eager young intern who wanted to learn. She began to teach him. In the evenings, after everyone else had gone home, the two of them would stay in her office reviewing calculations, discussing theories, dreaming about the future of American engineering. Margaret treated Charles like a son, sharing her knowledge without reservation, explaining every detail of the revolutionary formula she was developing, and Charles wrote everything down, every number, every variable. Every step of Margaret's brilliant reasoning, everything went into a secret notebook he kept at home, far from anyone's eyes. The plan grew slowly, like a weed pushing through cracks in concrete. At first, Charles told himself he was just learning, but the seed of ambition had been planted and it would not stop growing. On a Thursday evening, 4 months after he had first approached Margaret, Charles put his plan into action. He waited until she went to the restroom and slipped into her office. His heart pounded so hard he could feel the pulse in his temples. His hands were sweating, but ambition was stronger than any fear. The main notebook was right there on the desk, with the complete formula finally finished after 4 years of painstaking work. Margaret had confided that very afternoon that she was going to present her discovery to the board of directors the following week. She was radiant, her eyes sparkling like a child's on Christmas Eve. She said her life was about to change, that she would finally receive the recognition she deserved, that she could help Robert and Anna buy a proper house when they decided to start a family. Charles photographed every page with a camera he had bought specifically for that night. 72 photographs that captured not just numbers and formulas, but the work of a lifetime, the dreams of a good woman, the hopes of a family that believed the world rewarded those who deserved it. Then he returned to his desk and pretended nothing had happened. The next morning he arrived earlier than everyone else. He went straight to the office of the general director, a heavy-set man named Morrison, who cared about only 2 things in life, money and power. Charles placed the photographs on the desk and spoke the words that would change his destiny forever. I have developed a formula that will revolutionize structural engineering. I have spent 4 years working on this in secret, and I want to present it to you before anyone else sees it. Morrison looked at the calculations. He called other engineers to verify. When they confirmed that this was genuine, that this formula really worked and was worth millions, the director looked at Charles with a gleam of greed in his eyes. "Young man, you have just secured your future at this company." The official presentation happened 3 days later. Charles, wearing a new suit bought with the advance Morrison had given him, took the stage in the company auditorium and presented the formula as if it were his own. He explained every detail, answered every question, received every round of applause with the confidence of someone who believes his own lies. Margaret was in the audience. Charles remembered perfectly the expression on her face when she realized what was happening. First confusion, then disbelief, and finally, when the complete truth revealed itself in all its cruelty, a pain so deep it seemed capable of splitting the woman in half. Margaret tried to protest. She stood up in the middle of the presentation, her voice trembling with outrage, and accused Charles of theft. She said that formula was hers, that she had worked on it for 4 years, that she had proof in her notebooks. But when they went to check Margaret's notebooks, the main pages were blank. Charles had returned to her office the night before and replaced the original notebook with an identical copy, only without the most important calculations, without the proof Margaret needed to defend herself. The company's leadership did not hesitate. Margaret was accused of trying to steal credit for the work of a younger, more talented colleague. She was fired for cause that same day, escorted out of the building by security guards as if she were a criminal. Human resources did not even give her time to collect her personal belongings from her desk. Someone threw everything into a cardboard box and left it at the reception, as if her possessions were contaminated, as if their presence in the building could stain the company's reputation. Charles watched everything from the window of the office he had just been given. He saw Margaret walk unsteadily through the parking lot, her shoulders hunched under an invisible weight, the dignity of a lifetime shattered in a matter of hours. He saw the way she stopped in the middle of the path, turned to look at the building one last time, and wiped a tear that ran down her aged face. For an instant, just an instant, something inside Charles twisted with remorse. But he suffocated that feeling before it could take root. He told himself he had done what needed to be done, that the world belonged to the strong, not the naive, that Margaret was a fool for trusting people, and that fools did not deserve rewards. In the years that followed, the stolen formula transformed Charles Worthington into a legend. He rose through the company like a rocket, went from intern to director in less than 5 years, and eventually opened his own firm using the prestige he had won at another woman's expense. Worthington Engineering was born from a lie. It grew fed by injustice, and it prospered while its true creator withered away in obscurity. Charles learned that Margaret never got another job in the field. Her reputation had been destroyed forever. She ended up giving private math lessons to survive, charging almost nothing from students who could barely afford to pay. Robert, her son, carried the weight of the injustice his mother had suffered. Years later, he married Anna, and together they had a son named Nathan. Margaret adored that grandchild from the moment he was born, seeing in his curious eyes the same love for numbers that had defined her entire life. Margaret's husband had passed away years before the theft, so she faced everything alone. She grew old in silence, keeping the truth like a stone around her neck. Charles had seen the obituary 2 years ago, a small notice lost among classified ads. Margaret Holloway, 84, passed away after a long illness. She is survived by her grandson, Nathan. What the obituary did not say, what Charles only discovered much later, was that Robert and Anna had died in a car accident 3 years before Margaret. A rainy night, a slippery road, a truck that lost control. They left behind a 7-year-old boy named Nathan, who went to live with his grandmother. Margaret spent her final years raising that child. She taught him everything she knew. She passed on every formula, every theorem, every mathematical secret. She prepared that boy for a cruel world, and before she departed, she made her grandson promise that he would use that knowledge not for revenge, but for something greater. Nathan. The name now carried a completely different weight. A 10-year-old grandson with dirty blonde hair and eyes that shone with an impossible intelligence. A street boy who had solved in seconds a problem that the greatest specialists in the country could not decipher. A child who carried on his thin shoulders the weight of a legacy worth more than the entire empire Charles had built. The formula no one could solve. The equation threatening to bring down the 45-story tower. The problem that had defeated 6 millionaire consultants. It was a variation of the same formula Charles had stolen 30 years ago. The knowledge had been passed from grandmother to grandson, preserved like a flame that refuses to die. Margaret had prepared Nathan for this moment. And now that boy, living on the streets, carried in his mind the legacy of a genius the world had forgotten. But he had not come just to solve a mathematical problem. He had come to collect a debt of 30 years of lies. A debt of shattered dreams and stained reputations, a debt that no amount of money in the world could pay. Grandmother Margaret sends her regards. The phrase on the napkin now made terrible sense. It was not just a message, it was a warning. The secrets buried for 3 decades had found their way back to the surface. Charles walked to the window, watching dawn paint the Manhattan horizon in shades of pink and gold. The city was waking up without knowing that an empire built on sand was about to face the strongest tide of its existence. He needed to find that boy. He needed to know what Nathan knew and what cards he held, and above all, he needed to stop the truth from coming to light. Because if the world discovered what Charles Worthington had done, it would not just be his reputation that would crumble, it would be the lie of an entire lifetime, the lie upon which he had built every brick of his empire. It would be everything. Absolutely everything. And for the first time since he could remember, Charles felt something he thought he had left behind along with his conscience on that night when he photographed another woman's notebook. Fear. Real fear. The kind of fear that no amount of money can buy protection from. The underpass beneath the Brooklyn Bridge was the kind of place that people like Charles Worthington pretended did not exist. A parallel world hidden beneath tons of concrete, where the forgotten of the city built their lives with cardboard, torn blankets, and the stubborn hope of seeing the sun rise one more day. It was there that Nathan woke up that morning, with his grandmother's notebook still pressed against his chest. The boy sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes with the back of his dirty hands. Around him, other homeless people still slept, wrapped in layers of fabric and newspaper that barely protected them from the cold rising off the cement floor. No one paid attention to him. In that universe, Everyone carried the weight of their own survival, and a child alone was just another shadow among many. Nathan opened the notebook to the first page, where his grandmother's trembling handwriting had written words he knew by heart, but needed to read every morning to find strength. For my grandson, Nathan, you are the light that kept me alive when everything else had gone dark. In this notebook is my entire life, my formulas, my discoveries, and the truth the world needs to know. Use it wisely. Use it with love. And never ever let anger take over your heart. Your grandmother who loves you forever, Margaret. A tear ran down the boy's face before he could stop it. 2 years had already passed since his grandmother closed her eyes for the last time, but the pain was still as alive as it was on the first day. Nathan remembered every detail of that night in the public hospital. The smell of disinfectant, the fluorescent lights buzzing on the ceiling, his grandmother's hand holding his with a strength that seemed impossible for such a weak woman. "Come here, my boy." Margaret's voice was just a thread at that moment. "Sit close to Grandma." Nathan obeyed, his eyes brimming with tears, his heart squeezed in a way no 8-year-old child should ever know. "I need to tell you a story, Nathan. A story I kept for 30 years, waiting for the right moment." The old woman paused to catch her breath. "It is about a man who took everything from me. My work, my honor, my dreams. A man who built an empire on top of my life." "Who, Grandma?" "His name is Charles Worthington, and everything he has, everything he achieved was stolen from me." Margaret told everything that night. Every detail of the theft, every humiliation she suffered, every door that closed in her face after her reputation was destroyed. She told about the years of poverty, about the loneliness of facing the world without her husband, about watching her son Robert grow up, carrying a surname stained by a lie. "I could have destroyed that man, Nathan. I had proof. I had witnesses. I had everything saved in this notebook you are holding." The old woman's eyes shone with something that seemed to transcend the death that was approaching. "But I did not do it. Do you know why?" Nathan shook his head, unable to speak through the tears. "Because revenge is a poison we drink, hoping the other person will die." Margaret squeezed her grandson's hand with surprising strength. "I kept this notebook for you, my boy. Not to destroy anyone, but so you could have the chance to do something I never managed to do." "What, Grandma?" "Give that man the opportunity to redeem himself, to look at the truth and choose to be better." A tear ran down Margaret's wrinkled face. "Some people need to be saved from themselves, Nathan. And sometimes the only ones capable of doing that are precisely those who would have every reason to want to see them destroyed. But how will I know when it is the right time?" Margaret smiled, that tired but loving smile Nathan would never forget. "You will know, my grandson. The heart always knows." Those were the last words his grandmother said before closing her eyes forever. Nathan closed the notebook and tucked it inside his shirt, next to his chest, where he kept it protected day and night. 2 years on the streets had taught the boy many things. He had learned which restaurants threw away good food, which security guards were kind and which were cruel, which corners offered shelter from the rain and which were territory of dangerous people. But the most important lesson he already carried with him from before he knew the harshness of the streets, the lesson of forgiveness. After his grandmother passed, the social workers came. They talked about shelters, foster homes, a system that would take care of him. But Nathan had seen what that system did to other children. He had heard the stories, and he knew that if he entered that world, he would lose the only thing he had left of his grandmother, his freedom to fulfill the promise he had made. So he ran. He learned to survive. He learned to be invisible. He learned that the streets of New York could be cruel, but they could also be kind if you knew where to look. The boy stood up slowly and began walking toward the underpass exit. He had a long day ahead. And if his instincts were correct, it would not be long before Charles Worthington came looking for him. Nathan smiled to himself as he blended into the flow of pedestrians on the avenue. He was counting on it. The soup line at St. Michael's Church on the Lower East Side started forming every day at 11 in the morning. By 11:30, there were already dozens of people waiting, a silent procession of stories that most of the world preferred to ignore. Mrs. Mildred Hayes had been running that line for 17 years, ever since her husband Franklin passed, and she discovered that helping others was the only remedy for the loneliness that threatened to consume her. She was 74 years old, with white hair she kept in a loose bun, and hands that trembled slightly when she held the soup pot, but her eyes still sparkled with a warmth that made everyone who approached feel a little less alone. She knew almost all the homeless people in the region. She knew their names, their stories, their lost dreams, but none of them had touched her heart like the brown-eyed boy who had appeared there 2 years ago. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Mildred." Nathan's voice made the old woman turn with a smile that lit up her entire wrinkled face. "Nathan, my child, I was worried about you. It has been 4 days since you showed up." The boy approached and accepted the plate of soup she offered, sitting on the wooden bench next to the old woman. "I had to take care of some things, Mrs. Mildred. Important things." "What kind of things?" The concern was genuine in the woman's voice. "You know you can tell me anything, do you not?" Nathan took a sip of the hot soup, feeling the warmth travel down his throat and warm his chest. He looked at the woman who had become the closest thing to a grandmother he had since losing everything, and decided she deserved to know at least part of the truth. "Remember the stories I told you about my grandmother? About the man who stole her work?" Mrs. Mildred nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I found that man, Mrs. Mildred. I looked into his eyes, and I showed him that my grandmother's knowledge did not die." The old woman was silent for a long moment, processing the boy's words. "And what do you intend to do now, my child?" Nathan finished the soup and set the plate aside, his eyes fixed on some distant point. "My grandmother made me promise something before she left. She made me promise I would not use what I know for revenge. She made me promise I would give that man a chance to do the right thing." The boy turned to face the old woman. "And that is what I am going to do." "But Nathan, that man, he is dangerous. Rich and powerful people do not like being confronted. They do not like having their secrets discovered." "I know." The boy smiled, a smile that seemed to belong to someone much older. "But my grandmother used to say that courage is not the absence of fear. It is doing the right thing even when you are afraid." Mrs. Mildred felt her eyes fill with tears. In all her years of volunteer work, she had never met a child like this one. A child who carried the weight of a monstrous injustice on his shoulders, but who still chose the path of forgiveness instead of destruction. "Your grandmother was a very wise woman, Nathan." "Yes, she was." The boy stood up and hugged the old woman tightly, "and I promised I would honor her memory, no matter what it costs." Before pulling away, Nathan took a folded paper from his pocket and placed it in Mrs. Mildred's hand. "If something happens to me, if I disappear, or if someone comes asking about me, I want you to keep this." His eyes were serious, determined. "It is the address of a safe place where I hid a copy of my grandmother's notebook. If I cannot finish what I started, I want you to make sure the truth comes out." "Nathan, you are scaring me." "You do not need to be afraid, Mrs. Mildred. I trust everything will work out." The boy smiled again. "But my grandmother also taught me that hope is not a plan. We have to be prepared for everything." And with those words, Nathan said goodbye and disappeared into the crowd on the street, leaving Mrs. Mildred with a heavy heart and a silent prayer on her lips. That same night, while the city fell asleep under a starless sky, one of Charles Worthington's men finally got a lead. A homeless man near the Manhattan Bridge, in exchange for a few bills, revealed that he knew the blonde boy with brown eyes. He said the kid usually slept under the underpass near the Brooklyn Bridge, but had lately been seen talking to an old woman who served soup at a church on the Lower East Side. The information reached Charles in less than an hour. "St. Michael's Church." He repeated the words as if they were coordinates to a treasure. "I want men there tomorrow morning. I want them to watch every person who approaches that old woman, and when the boy shows up, I want to be informed immediately." "And what do we do when we find him, sir?" Charles hesitated. It was a question he himself had asked dozens of times in the past few days. What exactly did he intend to do when he found that boy? "Just let me know," he finally answered. "I will handle it myself." After hanging up the phone, Charles walked to the window of his apartment and stood watching the sleeping city. Somewhere out there, a 10-year-old boy slept clutching a notebook full of secrets that could destroy him. But for the first time, Charles was not thinking about how to silence that threat. He was thinking about the words written on the napkin. "Grandmother Margaret sends her regards," and about the expression of compassion in the eyes of a child who had every reason in the world to hate him, but who had still chosen a different approach. What did that boy really want? And why, despite all the fear he felt, did a part of Charles desperately want to find out the answer? Sleep did not come that night, nor the one before, and Charles was beginning to suspect it would not come again until he had the courage to face the truth he had been running from for 30 years, the truth about who he really was, and about who he could still choose to be. Sunday dawned gray over New York, with heavy clouds that seemed to carry the weight of all the city's secrets. In Central Park, The first rays of light struggled to break through that curtain of concrete and fog, slowly illuminating the wooden benches worn by time, the tired trees that insisted on living despite the urban chaos, and the pigeons that were already beginning their daily routine of survival among the crumbs left by passers-by. Nathan arrived at 7:15, 15 minutes before the time he had mentally set. The morning air was cold, and he rubbed his hands to warm them as he walked to the same bench as always, the one facing the lake where ducks glided peacefully, oblivious to the dramas unfolding around them. He sat down slowly, feeling the cold wood through his thin shorts, and began tossing breadcrumbs to the birds that gathered at his feet like old friends. His grandmother's notebook was safe inside his shirt, as always. The familiar weight against his chest was comforting, a constant presence reminding him that he was not alone, even when everything around him said otherwise. But today, in addition to the notebook, Nathan carried something more, an unshakable certainty that this would be the most important day of his life since the night his grandmother departed. He knew Charles Worthington's men were watching. He had noticed the strange movements over the past few days, the looks that lingered too long, the cars that passed slowly through the streets for no apparent reason. He was not afraid. In fact, it was exactly what he had been waiting for. At 7:42, a black car with tinted windows parked on the street bordering the park. Nathan did not turn to look, but he felt the presence before he even heard the footsteps. Charles Worthington walked slowly toward the bench where the boy was sitting. He was wearing casual clothes for the first time since Nathan had seen him, jeans and a light blue shirt, as if he were trying to look less threatening, less powerful, less like himself. The two remained in silence for a long moment. Charles standing, Nathan sitting, the pigeons between them like small winged witnesses to this unlikely encounter. "You knew I would come." It was not a question. Nathan finally raised his eyes, meeting the gaze of the man who had destroyed his grandmother's life. "You have not been able to sleep for over a week, Mr. Worthington. You have deep circles under your eyes, you have lost weight, and your right hand will not stop shaking." The boy pointed to Charles's fingers, which were indeed trembling slightly. Guilt does that to people. It eats away from the inside until nothing is left. Charles felt a shiver run down his spine. How could this child see through him so easily? "May I sit down?" Nathan gestured to the space beside him on the bench. Charles hesitated for a moment, then sat, keeping a respectful distance between them. The silence that followed was different from the previous one, denser, more charged with unspoken words and questions neither of them knew how to ask. "Your name is Nathan," Charles finally said. "I found out. I know you found out, just as you found out about my parents, about my grandmother, about everything." Nathan continued feeding the pigeons, his voice calm as the surface of a lake. "Your men are not as discreet as they think. You could have run. You could have hidden somewhere I would never find you." "I could have," the boy agreed. "But that is not what my grandmother prepared me for." Charles swallowed hard. Every word from this child seemed to carry the weight of decades of accumulated pain. "What exactly did your grandmother tell you about me?" Nathan stopped throwing crumbs and turned to face Charles directly. His brown eyes, so similar to Margaret's, shone with an intensity that made the businessman look away. "Everything." The word fell between them like a sentence. "She told me about the nights you spent in her office, pretending you wanted to learn. She told me about the photographs you took of her notebook. She told me about the presentation where you went up on stage and stole 30 years of work in front of everyone." Charles felt tears begin to form in the corners of his eyes. He did not try to stop them. "She told me how you switched her notebook for an empty copy so she would have no proof, about how you watched from the window while the security guards dragged her out of the building as if she were a criminal, not the victim." Nathan's voice remained steady, but there was an ancient pain hidden in every syllable, a wound that time had not managed to heal completely. "She told me about the years that followed, about the doors that closed in her face, about the hunger she endured, about the shame of not being able to support her family anymore." Tears now flowed freely down Charles's face, tracing wet paths down cheeks he had always kept so composed before the world. He could not remember the last time he had cried like this, without control, without shame. Perhaps he had never truly cried in his entire adult life. Perhaps he had forgotten how to do it somewhere along the way, along with so many other things that make a person human. "Your grandmother, she was right to hate me. My grandmother never hated you." The statement caught Charles completely off guard. He turned to look at the boy, incredulous. What do you mean, after everything I did? Nathan took a deep breath before continuing. In the last 2 years of her life, when I lived with her after my parents passed, my grandmother taught me many things. Mathematics, physics, engineering, everything she knew, she passed on to me. The boy paused, his eyes filling with tears for the first time. But the most important lesson was not in any formula. What lesson? That forgiveness is not a gift we give to those who hurt us. It is a gift we give to ourselves. Nathan wiped a tear that ran down his face. My grandmother spent 30 years carrying the weight of what you did. And you know what she discovered in the end? Charles shook his head, unable to speak. That the weight was not from the betrayal. The weight was from the resentment she fed every day. And when she finally managed to forgive you in the last months of her life, she told me it was like removing a 100-pound stone from her back. The businessman covered his face with his hands, his shoulders trembling with silent sobs. There he was, the most powerful man in structural engineering in New York, crying like a child on a park bench before a street boy who had every reason to want to destroy him. I do not deserve forgiveness. Charles's voice came out muffled by his hands. I destroyed your grandmother's life. I destroyed your family. You are living on the streets because of me. Nathan moved closer, placing his small hand on the shoulder of the man who was sobbing. You are right. You did terrible things, things that hurt many people for a long time. The boy's voice was soft but firm. But my grandmother taught me something else too. Charles raised his eyes, meeting the boy's gaze through his tears. She taught me that no person is only the worst thing they did, that inside everyone there is the possibility of change, of choosing to be different, of waking up one day and deciding you no longer want to be who you were yesterday. Nathan carefully removed the notebook from inside his shirt, as if he were handling something sacred, and placed it in Charles's lap. It is all here, Mr. Worthington, the proof of what you did 30 years ago. Documents, dates, names of witnesses, everything my grandmother kept for 3 decades, waiting for the right moment. Charles looked at the notebook as if it were a bomb about to explode. His hands trembled as he touched the worn cover, as he felt the weight of those pages that carried not just mathematical formulas, but the record of an injustice that had shaped entire lives. Why are you giving me this? Because it is not mine to keep, and because I do not want you to live the rest of your life afraid that someone will find out. Nathan stood up from the bench, standing before the businessman. What you do with that notebook is your choice. You can burn it and pretend nothing happened. You can continue living the lie you have lived for the past 30 years. He paused, letting the words sink in. Or you can do the right thing. The right thing? Charles repeated, his voice faltering. And what would the right thing be? You know. You have always known. Nathan took a step back, preparing to leave. My grandmother did not want revenge, Mr. Worthington. She wanted justice. She wanted the world to know the truth. Not to destroy you, but to free you both. Both of us. You and her. Because as long as this lie exists, you will remain its prisoner. You will keep waking up in the middle of the night afraid. You will keep looking over your shoulder, waiting for the day everything will crumble. Nathan smiled, a sad but genuine smile. My grandmother found peace when she told me the truth. Maybe you will find yours when you tell the world. Charles sat in silence for a long moment, holding the notebook against his chest, as if it were the most precious thing in the universe. And in a way it was. It was the key to his prison, and also the key to his liberation. And you? He finally asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. What do you want from me, Nathan? Money, a home? I can give you all that and much more. The boy slowly shook his head. I do not want anything from you, Mr. Worthington. Nothing that can be bought with money. His eyes shone with a maturity no child should possess. I only want one thing. What? I want you to look in the mirror tomorrow morning and like what you see. Nathan began to step back, walking backward so he could keep looking into the businessman's eyes. I want you to sleep in peace for the first time in 30 years. I want you to discover that it is never too late to become the person you should have been from the beginning. Charles stood up from the bench, still holding the notebook. Nathan, wait. The boy stopped but did not come back. How can I find you again? After I decide what to do. Nathan smiled. You know where St. Michael's Church is. Every Sunday at 11 in the morning I am there helping Mrs. Mildred serve soup. He paused. But Mr. Worthington? Yes? Do not come looking for me until you have made your decision, until you are sure of who you want to be. The boy turned completely and began walking toward the lake. My grandmother waited 30 years for the truth. I can wait a few more weeks. And then, without looking back, Nathan disappeared among the trees of Central Park, his small figure swallowed by the morning mist that was beginning to lift, leaving behind a man facing the most important decision of his existence. Charles remained standing for a long time, losing track of the hours that passed. The sun rose in the sky, the clouds gradually dispersed, and the park filled with life around him. Families strolling, couples holding hands, children running after pigeons. Life went on its normal course for everyone except him. The notebook remained in his hands, heavy as lead, light as a promise. For the first time in 30 years, Charles Worthington did not know what to do. He had no consultants to advise him, no lawyers to find loopholes, no money that could buy a way out. He was alone with his conscience, perhaps for the first time since he was an ambitious young man of 28, who thought he could build an empire by stealing another woman's dreams. But for the first time in 30 years, he knew who he wanted to be. And that perhaps was the beginning of everything, the beginning of the end of a lie, and the beginning of a truth that was 30 years overdue. 3 weeks passed since that Sunday morning in Central Park, 3 weeks in which Charles Worthington was no longer the same man. Margaret's notebook stayed on his bedside table throughout those days, like a silent companion watching him sleep, wake, and spend hours staring at the ceiling while fighting the hardest battle of his life, the battle against himself. On the first nights, Charles thought about burning those pages. It would be so easy. A match, a few seconds, and 30 years of evidence would turn to ashes. No one would ever know. But every time he reached toward the notebook, he saw Nathan's eyes. Those brown eyes that did not ask for revenge, did not demand punishment, only offered something Charles did not deserve: a chance. "I want you to look in the mirror tomorrow morning and like what you see." The boy's words echoed in his mind like a melody he could not forget. During the second week, Charles began reading the notebook from beginning to end. Not the mathematical formulas, which he already knew too well, but the personal notes Margaret had made over the years. Small records of a life he had destroyed without thinking twice. Today my grandson Nathan solved his first quadratic equation. He is only 7 years old. His eyes shone the same way mine shone when I discovered my love for mathematics. Perhaps this is what they call a true legacy. Charles wept reading those words. He wept more than he had wept in his entire adult life combined. Robert asked me today why I never tried to get revenge on the man who stole my formula. I explained to him that revenge is like drinking poison, hoping the other person will die. He did not fully understand, but one day he will, just as Nathan will understand when the time comes. Each page revealed a woman Charles never bothered to know. A kind, wise woman who, even after having her life destroyed, still found reasons to smile, to teach, to love. And it was on the last page of the notebook that Charles found something that changed everything. A letter, written in trembling handwriting, probably in the final days of Margaret's life. To whoever finds this notebook, if you are reading this, it is probably because my grandson Nathan decided the time has come. I trust his judgment more than I have trusted anyone in my life. I could have used these pages to destroy Charles Worthington. I had enough evidence to send him to prison, to take from him everything he built with my formula. For many years, I dreamed of doing exactly that. But life taught me that true victory is not in bringing down those who hurt us. It is in not allowing the evil of others to transform us into bad people too. Charles, if you are reading this, know that I forgave you a long time ago. Not because you deserved it, but because I deserved peace. I deserved to sleep without hatred in my heart. I deserved to die at peace with my conscience. Now the choice is yours. You can continue being the man you were for the past 30 years, or you can discover who you could have been if you had not chosen the wrong path. It is never too late to do the right thing. With hope, Margaret Holloway. Charles read that letter 12 times that night, and when the sun rose the next morning, he finally knew what he needed to do. The press conference was called for a Friday at 10 in the morning, in the main hall of Worthington Engineering. More than 50 journalists packed the space, television cameras positioned in every corner, microphones pointed at the empty podium. No one expected what happened. Charles entered the room wearing a simple suit, without the luxury accessories he normally displayed. There was no expensive watch on his wrist, no gold cufflinks. He looked smaller somehow, more human. He walked to the podium with steady steps, but his eyes carried something no one there had ever seen before: vulnerability, fear, and a silent determination that made his chin tremble slightly. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming." His voice was strangely calm. "I called you here today to make a confession I should have made 30 years ago." The murmuring in the room ceased immediately. Cameras adjusted, recorders moved closer, pens stopped over notepads. 30 years ago, I was a young intern without talent, without prospects, and without scruples. I worked at a company where I met the most brilliant person who ever crossed my path. Her name was Margaret Holloway. Charles paused, breathing deeply to control the emotion threatening to take over his voice. Margaret spent 4 years developing a revolutionary formula for structural calculation, a discovery worth millions that would change civil engineering forever. Another pause. "And I stole that formula from her." The silence in the room was absolute. No one moved, no one breathed. "I did not just steal, I destroyed her life. I switched her notebook for an empty copy so she would have no proof. I let them accuse her of being a liar, an envious person trying to steal credit for someone else's work. I watched while she was humiliated and expelled from the company like a criminal." Tears began to run down Charles's face, but he made no effort to hide them. "Everything I built, every building I raised, every contract I signed, every penny I earned in the past 30 years was built on a lie, on the work of a woman I destroyed without mercy." Charles raised Margaret's notebook, showing it to the cameras. "This is the original notebook of Margaret Holloway. It contains all the proof of what I am saying. I am delivering a copy to every media outlet present, and the original will be donated to the archives of Columbia University, where it will be available to anyone who wants to verify the truth." The journalist began asking questions, but Charles raised his hand, asking for silence. "I'm not finished. Besides this confession, I'm announcing my immediate resignation as CEO of Worthington Engineering. I'm also giving up 80% of my personal assets, which will be used to create a scholarship fund for young people from low-income families who want to study engineering and mathematics." He made one last pause, looking directly at the cameras. "This fund will not carry my name. It will carry the name of who truly deserves to be remembered. It will be called the Margaret Holloway Scholarship Fund, because it is time for the world to know who was the real genius behind everything I built." The conference ended in chaos. Questions shouted, flashes firing, journalists trying to get closer. But Charles simply stepped down from the podium and left through the back door, leaving behind the empire he had built on a lie. On the following Sunday, at 11 in the morning, Charles returned to St. Michael's Church. The soup line was already forming when Charles arrived. Dozens of people waited in silence, a procession of stories that most of the world preferred to ignore. And there, behind the steaming pot, stood Mrs. Mildred Hayes, her white hair in a loose bun, her eyes shining with warmth. And beside her, helping distribute plates with a serene smile, was Nathan. The boy looked different. His clothes were still simple, but clean. His blonde hair had been cut and combed, and there was something on his face that had not been there before: peace. Charles walked slowly, feeling the weight of each step. When he got close enough, Nathan raised his eyes and smiled, a simple smile, without judgment, without demands, without bitterness. "You came. I came." Charles looked at the people in line, at the church, at the pot of soup. "I saw the news." "I saw too." Nathan continued serving soup. "Mrs. Mildred cried all day. She said my grandmother can finally rest in peace." The two remained in silence for a moment, letting the sounds of the city fill the space between them. "I lost almost everything, Nathan. The company, the money, the reputation. The newspapers are calling me a fraud, a thief." Charles let out a sad laugh. "And for the first time in my life, they are right. You lost things," Nathan corrected gently. "But you gained something you did not have." "What?" "The truth." The boy turned to look into Charles's eyes. "My grandmother used to say that a lie is a prison without bars. The person thinks they are free because they can go wherever they want, but they are actually trapped inside their own head, afraid someone will find out." Charles nodded slowly, feeling the weight of those words. "Your grandmother was an extraordinary woman." "Yes, she was," Nathan smiled. "And now the whole world knows it." Mrs. Mildred approached, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes were red, as if she had been crying recently. "Mr. Worthington," her voice was soft but firm, "I watched your press conference. What you did took courage. It was the least I could do. After everything, I know." The old woman placed a hand on his arm. "Nathan told me everything, about his grandmother, about what happened 30 years ago, about the promise he made. Charles looked at the boy, who continued serving soup with that calm that seemed to belong to someone much older. "He is an incredible child, Mrs. Mildred. I have never met anyone like him." "Neither have I," the old woman smiled. "That is why I asked him to live with me." Charles felt his heart skip a beat. "What? My house has been too quiet since Franklin passed, and Nathan needs a home, a family, a chance to go back to school and be a child again." Mrs. Mildred looked at the boy with eyes full of love. He accepted. "We are going to take care of each other." Nathan approached, placing his small hand on Mrs. Mildred's arm. "She is going to help me study mathematics, like my grandmother wanted." Charles felt tears return to his eyes. There, in that simple church, before a pot of soup, something beautiful was being born, something that no amount of money could buy. "I want to help." The words came out before Charles could think. "I know I lost most of what I had, but I still have enough to make sure Nathan has everything he needs. School books, whatever is necessary." Nathan shook his head slowly. "You do not need to do that, Mr. Worthington. I know I do not need to, but I want to." Charles knelt until his face was level with the boy's. "Your grandmother gave me a second chance. You gave me a second chance. Let me honor that. Let me do something right for once in my life." Nathan looked at Mrs. Mildred, who nodded with a smile. Then he looked back at Charles. "My grandmother taught me an incredible formula, Mr. Worthington, a formula that built buildings, that revolutionized engineering, that changed the world. But the greatest formula she taught me had nothing to do with numbers." "What was it?" Nathan smiled, his eyes shining with the same light that once shone in the eyes of Margaret Holloway. "Forgiveness plus truth equals freedom. That is the formula no one can steal, because it is not in the notebooks." He placed his hand on his own chest. "It is here, in the heart of whoever has the courage to use it." Charles pulled the boy into a hug, tears streaming freely down his face. There, in front of everyone, without shame, without fear, he held Nathan as if holding the redemption he had spent 30 years searching for without knowing. And they finally pulled apart. Nathan looked into the eyes of the man who had once destroyed his grandmother and saw something that had not been there before. Hope. "Go in peace, Mr. Worthington, and whenever you look at a building, remember that the greatest things we construct are not made of concrete and steel. They are made of the choices we make every day." Charles stood up, wiped his tears, and looked one last time at the boy who had changed his life. "Thank you, Nathan, for everything. Thank my grandmother." The boy smiled. She always believed that everyone deserves a second chance, even those who seem to deserve it least. And with those words, Charles Worthington walked away from St. Michael's Church, carrying in his heart a peace he had not felt in 30 years. Behind him, Nathan returned to serving soup beside Mrs. Mildred, his new family. And as the autumn sun finally broke through the clouds over New York, the boy whispered words that only he and the wind could hear. "We did it, Grandma, just like you taught me." And somewhere beyond the clouds and the skyscrapers and all the noise of that city that never sleeps, Margaret Holloway smiled, because the truth had finally set them all free.